For decades, the royal vault protected secrets so explosive they could fracture the monarchy itself. But on one cold, silent morning, everything changed. A single letter sealed, signed, and hidden since Princess Diana's final hours was released without warning. Its contents stunned palace insiders, shattered unspoken agreements, and named an heir no one expected. In one moment, Diana reached across time and changed the future of the crown forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The announcement did not arrive with ceremony. There was no gentle preparation, no gradual whisper of what was coming. It appeared suddenly, quietly, and with devastating precision. Palace officials who had spent their lives guarding royal stability found themselves caught in a moment they could not control. The letter had been recovered from among Princess Diana's most protected personal possessions, items sealed with a level of authority rarely granted even within royal protocol. This was not a forgotten note or a sentimental relic. This was something deliberate, something intentional, something that had been waiting, and the fact that it had remained hidden for so long raised a question no one could comfortably answer. Why now? Inside palace corridors, reactions were immediate but carefully restrained. Faces remained composed, voices remained steady, but beneath that discipline, something far more fragile had begun to fracture. Senior aides, individuals who had served multiple monarchs and weathered countless crises, were blindsided. They had not been warned, they had not been consulted. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they had not anticipated that Diana's voice could still carry this kind of authority. Because Diana was not simply remembered, she was still capable of acting. Her words, preserved in ink, carried the force of unfinished intention. The letter itself bore unmistakable signs of deliberate preservation. It had been sealed under extraordinary conditions, protected not merely as correspondence, but as something closer to a final directive. Palace historians and legal minds were immediately drawn into urgent private discussions, their task clear but daunting. Interpret Diana's final message. What had she intended? What had she foreseen? And why had she ensured this letter would surface only when the monarchy had already begun evolving into its next era? The emotional impact deepened as early whispers began to circulate within palace walls. The letter, it was said, did not speak vaguely. It did not suggest, it named, directly, clearly. Without hesitation, Catherine, Princess of Wales, Diana had chosen her. And in doing so, she had bypassed decades of tradition, decades of assumed authority, and decades of carefully maintained hierarchy. This was not a passive inheritance governed by institutional procedure. This was a personal decision made by a woman who understood exactly what her legacy represented. Those who understood the deeper symbolism realized immediately that this was not about jewelry. It was about continuity. It was about emotional sovereignty. Diana's jewels were never mere objects, they were extensions of her identity, reflections of her strength, and witnesses to her suffering. By naming Catherine, Diana had done more than pass on possessions. She had passed on meaning, she had passed on trust, and in doing so she had reshaped the emotional foundation of the monarchy itself. The timing only intensified the mystery. For years, the monarchy had worked to stabilize its image, to rebuild trust, to move forward while carefully managing the weight of its past. Yet now, without warning, Diana had returned, not in person, but in purpose. Her letter had emerged not as a relic, but as a living force. It demanded acknowledgement, it demanded acceptance, and it forced those who had long believed Diana's story had ended to confront an uncomfortable truth. She had never stopped shaping the crown's destiny. What made it even more unsettling was the unmistakable sense that Diana had anticipated this moment. She had understood the fragility of legacy. She had understood how easily memory could be softened, reshaped, or controlled. And so she had done something extraordinary. She had secured her voice. She had preserved her intention. She had ensured that when the time was right, when the future stood at a crossroads, her words would emerge and guide it. In that moment, the monarchy faced something it could neither predict nor prevent. A decision made decades ago had arrived intact, undeniable, and irreversible. Diana's voice, once thought silenced by tragedy, had returned with clarity and purpose. and as the full weight of her final message began to settle over palace walls, one truth became impossible to ignore. This letter was not simply a revelation, it was a reckoning. But to understand why this letter holds such devastating power, we must return to Diana's final days when she quietly began putting her most personal legacy in order. In her final days, Diana wasn't acting like a woman escaping the past. She was acting like someone preparing for the future. Behind closed doors, far from cameras and royal ceremony, she made decisions no one understood at the time. Decisions that would remain buried for decades. But now, with the release of her final letter, those quiet choices reveal a truth far more intentional and far more powerful than anyone ever imagined. By then, Diana had already endured the emotional fracture of separation, not just from a marriage, but from an entire system that had once defined her existence. The palace had been her home, but it had also been her cage, and now, standing outside its invisible walls, she began to see her life with a clarity that few ever achieve. There was no bitterness in her reflections, only certainty. She understood that her story was no longer simply her own. It belonged to history, it belonged to her sons. And most importantly, it belonged to the future they would inherit. This realization did not weaken her, it sharpened her resolve. Those closest to Diana noticed the shift immediately. Her conversations grew more deliberate, her trust became more selective. She began holding private meetings, quietly confiding in legal advisors and individuals whose loyalty had never wavered. These were not dramatic encounters. They were calm, measured, and purposeful. Diana was not reacting to fear. She was responding to foresight. She understood something others did not: that legacy, if left unprotected, could be reshaped by forces beyond her control. And she refused to allow her voice to become a casualty of time. What weighed most heavily on her heart was not reputation, it was her sons. William and Harry were not simply heirs to a throne, they were heirs to her truth, her pain, and her strength. Diana knew that symbols mattered. She knew that the emotional inheritance she left behind would shape how her sons understood themselves and their place within the monarchy. And among those symbols, none carried greater weight than her jewelry. These pieces were never just ornaments. They were silent witnesses to her transformation from a young bride, overwhelmed by expectation, to a woman who redefined the meaning of royal strength. They were extensions of her identity, fragments of her voice, that could continue speaking long after she was gone. It was during this period that Diana's thoughts turned toward the future in ways few could ever anticipated. She began to imagine the woman who would one day stand beside William, not just as his partner, but as his protector, his equal, and the emotional center of his world. Diana spoke quietly of trust, of resilience, of the kind of strength that did not demand attention, but commanded respect. She believed deeply that the future of the monarchy would depend not on tradition alone, but on authenticity. And somewhere within her private reflections, she began to form a belief, an unshakable intuition, that William's future wife would need more than acceptance. She would need Diana's voice beside her. What makes her letter so extraordinary is not its existence, but its precision. Every word was chosen carefully. There was no hesitation, no ambiguity. Diana was not leaving behind a suggestion. She was leaving behind certainty. She was ensuring that her intentions would remain intact, immune to reinterpreter or interference. This was not the act of someone lost in grief or anger. It was the act of someone fully aware of her place in history and fully determined to protect the future she believed in. In those final days, Diana was not retreating. She was securing something permanent. She was preserving her emotional authority in a world that often tried to define her without permission, and through that quiet act of preparation, she ensured that her presence would never truly fade. Because Diana understood something few others did, that legacy is not measured by how long someone lives, but by how powerfully their choices continue to shape the world after they are gone. But Diana's decisions were not made randomly. She understood the extraordinary power her jewelry held, and why choosing its future bearer would send a message no one could ignore. These were never just jewels. They were armor. They were memory. They were defiance. Every sapphire, every diamond Diana wore carried meaning far beyond its brilliance. They witnessed betrayal, heartbreak, strength, and transformation, and now Diana had chosen who would carry that legacy forward. That in doing so, she wasn't merely passing down ornaments, she was transferring authority, identity, and the emotional center of the monarchy itself. From the moment Diana first wore them, those jewels became inseparable from her story. They were present when she stepped into a world that demanded perfection, but offered little protection. They rested against her during moments of celebration, but they also bore silent witness to moments of isolation, when the weight of expectation pressed harder than any crown ever could. Each piece became more than decoration, it became a shield. It allowed her to stand firm when her voice trembled. It gave her presence when she felt invisible. And over time, the public stopped seeing them as royal property. They saw them as Diana's truth, made visible. Some of these pieces marked her most defining transformations. They were there when she chose independence over silence. They were there when she stepped forward, not as a royal figure bound by protocol, but as a woman who had reclaimed her identity. The jewels no longer represented the institution. They represented her survival, her refusal to disappear, her decision to remain emotionally present, even when the system around her tried to reduce her to a symbol, and that is what made them powerful. They carried the emotional imprint of someone who had endured, evolved, and ultimately redefined what it meant to belong. For William, their meaning ran even deeper. These were not objects to him, they were fragments of his mother's presence. They were reminders of her warmth, her courage, and her unwavering love. He had seen how the world reacted to those jewels, not because of their value, but because of what they represented. They were proof that Diana's influence had never required permission. She had created her own emotional authority, and those jewels became its most enduring expression. Passing them forward was never meant to be a matter of protocol. It was meant to be a continuation of her voice. This is what made Diana's decision so extraordinary. She understood the difference between institutional ownership and personal inheritance. Institutions preserve tradition, but personal inheritance preserves meaning. Diana did not want her legacy diluted by procedure. She wanted it carried by someone who understood its emotional weight, someone who would honor it, not as a privilege, but as a responsibility, someone who would carry it forward, not for power, but for purpose. Long before the letter surfaced, the public had already begun sensing this transition. Catherine's quiet strength, her composure under scrutiny, and her deep respect for the monarchy created a connection that felt unmistakable. She did not imitate Diana, and she did not attempt to replace her, but she embodied something familiar, something steady, something authentic. And without words, people began to associate her with the same emotional continuity Diana had once represented. It was not orchestrated, it was not assigned, it emerged naturally, yet within palace walls. That kind of symbolic evolution was far more complicated. The monarchy relied on structure, on order, on control, and the idea that Diana's personal legacy could move beyond institutional boundaries introduced a kind of uncertainty no protocol could easily resolve, because whoever inherited those jewels would inherit more than admiration. They would inherit emotional authority, they would inherit Diana's unfinished presence, and when Diana made her choice, she ensured that her legacy would remain alive, not confined to memory, but carried forward by someone she believed in. She understood that symbols shape perception, and perception shapes destiny. By choosing Catherine, Diana was not simply passing down objects, she was passing down continuity. She was ensuring that her emotional truth would never be rewritten or forgotten. And when the letter finally revealed Catherine as the chosen heir, it ignited a reaction inside palace walls that no protocol could contain. The room fell silent as Diana's words were read aloud. No one moved. No one spoke. Because in a single sentence, Diana had shifted the balance of emotional power inside the monarchy. Catherine named explicitly, undeniably, irrevocably. For some, it felt like destiny fulfilled. For others, it felt like control slipping away. And in that moment, the royal family realized Diana had just made a decision they could never undo. There had been no warning, no quiet preparation behind closed doors. The letter arrived like a force that could not be contained, and those who had spent their lives maintaining order suddenly found themselves confronting something beyond protocol. Senior royals who had assumed they understood every corner of Diana's legacy now faced a truth they had never anticipated. She had acted alone, she had decided alone, and she had done so in a way that bypassed every traditional safeguard designed to preserve institutional authority. This was not a shared decision. It was Diana's final assertion of personal power. The emotional reactions were immediate, though carefully restrained beneath layers of discipline. Some received the revelation with quiet acceptance, recognizing the emotional inevitability of Diana's choice. They understood her bond with William. They understood her instinct to protect the emotional future of her son's family. But others struggled in silence, their composure masking a deeper discomfort. Because this letter did rather than name an heir to jewelry, it named an heir to meaning, and meaning, within the monarchy, had always been carefully controlled. Behind palace walls, conversations began unfolding with urgency. Questions emerged that few dared to voice openly. Had Diana intended this as a personal gesture or as a symbolic correction to the very institution that had once constrained her? Had she foreseen a future moment when emotional authority would matter more than hierarchy? And perhaps most unsettling of all, had she anticipated resistance? Because the clarity of her words left no room for reinterpretation. She had not offered guidance. She had delivered a final decision. The deeper implications became impossible to ignore. For generations, the monarchy had relied on continuity defined by tradition. Authority flowed through established lines, reinforced by structure and precedent. But Diana had introduced something unpredictable. She had introduced personal will into a system that depended on collective control. By naming Catherine directly, she had placed emotional legitimacy above institutional expectation. And that shift created a quiet but undeniable tension. Some understood immediately what Catherine represented: not disruption, but evolution. Her growing emotional presence within the monarchy had already begun reshaping public perception. She carried herself with quiet resilience, never demanding attention, but never shrinking from responsibility. Diana had recognized that strength. She had trusted it. And now, through this letter, she had ensured that trust would endure beyond her lifetime. Yet the letter also forced the monarchy to confront something it had long avoided. Diana's influence had never faded. It had only been waiting. Her words carried the weight of unfinished intention, and their release reopened emotional fractures that had never fully healed. The instituted Ket, Ion, could not easily dismiss her voice, nor could it fully control its consequences. Because Diana was no longer bound by protocol, she was no longer constrained by expectation. She existed now as something far more powerful, a legacy that could not be negotiated. Private deliberations continued, driven by an unspoken recognition that this moment would define the monarchy's emotional future. To challenge Diana's wishes would risk appearing as a rejection of her memory. To accept them would acknowledge her enduring authority. It was a decision that carried no easy resolution, because this was not simply about inheritance. It was about identity. It was about trust. And it was about the undeniable truth that Diana's voice still held the power to shape the crown's destiny. And as the weight of her decision settled deeper into the hearts of those she had left behind, the emotional center of the monarchy began shifting in ways no one could reverse. Because Diana had not simply spoken, she had chosen. And nowhere was the emotional impact more profound than in the heart of the man who knew Diana not as a symbol, but as his mother. For Prince William, this wasn't about jewels. It was about hearing his mother's voice again. Her words, written in her final hours, carried across decades directly to him. And in naming Catherine, Diana wasn't just choosing an heir, she was affirming William's future, his family, and his path. But with that affirmation came an overwhelming emotional weight, because Diana wasn't just watching, she had chosen. For years, William had carried the quiet responsibility of preserving his mother's memory, not as a public figure, but as a son who had lived inside her love. Every object she left behind held meaning that few others could truly understand. They were not artifacts, they were fragments of her presence. They were reminders that she had existed not as a princess, but as a mother who had fought fiercely to protect her children from a world that often misunderstood her. And now, through this letter, her voice had returned not softened by time, but strengthened by purpose. There was comfort in that voice, but there was also pain. Because Diana's words did not simply look backward, they reached forward. They acknowledged William not as the grieving son he had once been, but as the man he had become. And in naming Catherine, Diana had done something profoundly personal. She had affirmed her belief in the future William had built. She had placed her trust not in tradition, not in protocol, but in the emotional foundation of his family. It was a gesture of confidence that carried enormous emotional weight. William understood immediately what it meant. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was his mother's final act of protection. She had chosen someone she believed would safeguard not just her legacy, but her truth. And that realization stirred something deep within him, a mixture of pride and grief that could not easily be separated. Pride because Diana had trusted his judgment, trusted his future, trusted the woman he loved. Grief because her words reminded him of everything that had been lost. Her absence had shaped him, but her presence preserved in this letter reminded him that she had never truly left. Catherine, too, felt the gravity of that trust. She had never sought to replace Diana, never sought to inherit her emotional space. But now, Diana herself had placed that responsibility in her hands. It was both humbling and overwhelming. Catherine understood that this was not about ownership. It was about continuity. It was about carrying forward a legacy built on resilience, compassion, and emotional truth. And in that moment, William and Catherine shared something unspoken but deeply understood. This was just Diana's gift. It was her blessing. For William, the letter created a strange and powerful sense of closure. It answered questions he had never voiced. It confirmed instincts he had always carried. Diana had seen the future clearly. She had trusted him to build it, and she had trusted Catherine to stand beside him as its emotional anchor. That trust gave William strength, but it also reopened wounds he had spent years learning to live with. Because hearing her voice again meant confronting the reality that she was still gone, and yet somehow still guiding him. It was in that realization that William began to understand the true meaning of Diana's decision. She had not simply passed down her legacy. She had secured it. She had ensured that her emotional presence would remain woven into the fabric of the monarchy's future. And in doing so, she had given William something he had long been denied: certainty. Certainty that his mother believed in him. Certainty that she believed in Catherine. Certainty that her story would not end in silence. But Diana's letter wasn't only about inheritance. It was about something far more enduring: trust, belief, and the future of the monarchy itself. Catherine never asked for this. She never demanded Diana's legacy. But now, Diana herself had placed it in her hands. The weight wasn't measured in diamonds, it was measured in expectation, symbolism, and history, because Diana hadn't simply chosen Catherine to wear her jewels. She had chosen Catherine to carry her story, and that responsibility would change Catherine's place in the monarchy forever. When Catherine first understood what Diana had done, her reaction was not triumph. It was silence. Not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of reverence. She knew instantly that this was not a gift in the traditional sense. It was a trust. Diana had reached forward through time and play, aced something fragile, something deeply personal, into her care. And Catherine, who had spent years navigating the delicate balance between public expectation and private restraint, understood that this moment would redefine her role in ways no title ever could. She had always approached Diana's memory with humility. She never attempted to step into her shadow, never tried to claim a connection that was not hers by experience. Instead, she honored Diana quietly, respectfully, allowing her presence to remain sacred. But now, Diana herself had bridged that distance. She had chosen Catherine not because of obligation, but because of belief. That realization carried enormous emotional weight, because it meant Diana had seen something in Catherine long before the world fully understood her significance. The responsibility was overwhelming, not because of its visibility, but because of its meaning. Catherine knew that Diana's legacy was not built on perfection. It was built on vulnerability, courage, and emotional authenticity. It was built on the willingness to stand firm, Even when standing alone, to carry that legacy required more than grace. It required strength. And Catherine, in her quiet way, had been preparing for that strength her entire life without even realizing it. As the reality of Diana's decision spread beyond palace walls, public perception began to shift. People no longer saw Catherine solely as the future queen by marriage. They saw her as something more personal, something chosen. Diana's trust had elevated her beyond institutional expectation. It had connected her directly to the emotional heart of the monarchy, and in doing so, it had transformed Catherine into a living bridge between what Diana had been and what the monarchy would become. Catherine did not respond with declarations. She did not seek to define the moment publicly. Instead, she absorbed it with the same composure that had defined her journey from the very beginning, because she understood that honoring Diana required more than acknowledgement. It required consistency, it required authenticity, it required living in a way that justified the faith Diana had placed in her, and Catherine accepted that responsibility, not as a burden, but as a purpose. There was something profoundly moving in the realization that Diana had shaped Catherine's destiny without ever meeting her. It was an act of extraordinary foresight. Diana had trusted not circumstance, but character. She had believed that Catherine possessed the emotional resilience necessary to carry forward her truth. And now, that belief had become reality. It existed not as an abstract idea, but as a living continuation of Diana's presence within the monarchy. Catherine understood that this was not the end of Diana's story. It was its continuation. Every choice she made moving forward would carry echoes of Diana's trust. Every moment of strength would reinforce the connection Diana had created. And in accepting this responsibility, Catherine stepped into something far greater than inheritance. She stepped into legacy. But as the palace struggled to adjust, one truth became unavoidable. Diana's voice had returned, and its impact could never be contained again. They believed Diana's story had ended. They believed time would soften her influence. But this letter proved something far more unsettling. Diana had never truly left. Her words still carried authority. Her choices still shaped the monarchy. And now, decades later, she had spoken again, reaching beyond death to guide the future she always believed in. For years, the monarchy had learned to exist in the shadow of her absence. Her name was spoken with respect, but her influence was often treated as something belonging to the past. Time, they believed, woe how, old create distance. Distance would create detachment, and detachment would allow the institution to move forward, unburdened by the emotional force she had once embodied. But Diana had understood something fundamental about legacy. She knew that true influence does not fade when a life ends. It deepens, it embeds itself into memory, into identity, into the emotional foundation of those who remain. And through this letter, she ensured that her voice would not merely be remembered, it would continue to act. What makes Diana's presence so extraordinary is that it was never dependent on permission. She had never needed institutional approval to command emotional loyalty. Her strength came from authenticity, from vulnerability, from the courage to be human within a system that often demanded emotional silence. That authenticity created a bond that time could not weaken. It created a connection that could not be replaced. And now, decades later, that connection had resurfaced with undeniable clarity. Her words had not lost their power. They had gained permanence. The monarchy, for all its structure and tradition, could not easily contain something so deeply personal. Diana existed outside its formal boundaries now. She was no longer subject to its expectations or limitations. She had become something far more enduring, a symbolic force that lived within the hearts of those who remembered her, not as a title, but as a truth. And that truth carried weight. It shaped perception, it shaped loyalty, it shaped the emotional direction of the crown itself. The public response reflected this reality immediately. There was no confusion, no hesitation. People understood instinctively what Diana's letter meant. It was not an act of nostalgia, it was an act of continuation. It affirmed what many had always believed, that Diana's legacy was never meant to disappear. It was meant to evolve, and Catherine, now chosen by Diana herself, became the living embodiment of that evolution. She represented not replacement, but continuity. She carried forward not just Diana's jewels, but her emotional presence. This shift created something profound within the monarchy. Its emotional center began to move not through official declaration, but through quiet acceptance. Diana's influence was no longer something confined to memory. It had become active, present, guiding. Her foresight had ensured that her voice would remain woven into the monarchy's future, impossible to separate from its identity. And in doing so, she had accomplished something few figures in history ever achieve. She had transcended her own lifetime. The crown, built on centuries of tradition, now faced a truth it could not ignore. Diana had made her final decision, and that decision carried an authority no protocol could override. It existed beyond negotiation, beyond reinterpretation. It demanded acknowledgement, not because it was enforced, but because it was undeniable. Her legacy had moved beyond remembrance. It had become destiny, and as Catherine stepped forward, carrying the emotional trust Diana had placed in her, the monarchy itself began to transform, not abruptly, but inevitably. Diana's story was no longer something that belonged solely to the past. It had become part of the future. Her voice had returned not as an echo, but as a guide. And as the world absorbed the full meaning of Diana's final words, one undeniable truth emerged: this wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her final chapter. In the end, Diana didn't need titles, crowns, or permission. She needed only her voice, and she used it to shape the future forever. By naming Catherine, she ensured her spirit would live on in the very heart of the monarchy. And in doing so, Diana achieved something extraordinary. She didn't just leave behind memories. She left behind certainty, purpose, and a legacy no one could ever erase. For so long, Diana had existed in a space defined by contradiction. She was loved by millions, yet constrained by tradition. She was admired as a symbol, yet misunderstood as a person. But in this final act, she reclaimed something entirely her own. She secured her emotional legacy not through ceremony, but through intention. Her letter became more than a message. It became a declaration that her story would never be rewritten by silence or softened by distance. It would remain intact, carried forward exactly as she intended. By choosing Catherine, Diana did something quietly revolutionary. She ensured that her emotional truth would continue breathing inside the monarchy itself. Catherine was not chosen for status. She was chosen for strength, for resilience, for the quiet dignity that mirrored Diana's own journey. And as Catherine stepped forward, carrying that trust, she became more than a future queen. She became the living embodiment of Diana's vision, a bridge between memory and destiny, between what had been lost and what was still to come. For William, this transformation carried profound meaning. His family now stood as the continuation of everything Diana had fought to protect. The love she had given him, the values she had instilled, and the emotional courage she had shown were no longer confined to memory. They existed in the present. They existed in his children. They existed in Catherine. Diana's influence had not ended with her absence. It had matured, evolved, and found new life in the very future she had believed in all along. The monarchy itself could not remain untouched by this moment. Diana's decision had introduced something no institution could manufacture: emotional authenticity. It reminded the crown that its strength did not come solely from addition, but from connection, from humanity, from the ability to evolve while honoring truth. And in accepting Diana's final wish, the monarchy began to move forward not by abandoning its past, but by embracing the emotional clarity she had provided. There was healing in this realization, not the kind that erased pain, but the kind that gave it meaning. Diana's voice, once interrupted by tragedy, had returned to complete its purpose. Her letter offered something that had long been missing: certainty. Certainty that her legacy was safe. Certainty that her story would not fade. Certainty that her influence would remain present in the choices shaping the monarchy's future. What makes Diana's triumph so powerful is that it was achieved without confrontation. She did not demand recognition. She did not seek validation. She simply ensured that her truth would endure. Time, which often diminishes influence, had instead strengthened hers. Silence, which often erases voices, had preserved hers. And now her legacy existed beyond challenge, beyond doubt, beyond disappearance. Catherine carried that legacy forward, not as an obligation, but as an honor. Every step she took reinforced the trust Diana had placed in her. Every act of quiet strength affirmed that Diana's faith had not been misplaced. And through Catherine, Diana's presence remained alive not as memory, but as continuation. The crown itself had been changed, not by force, but by belief. Diana had shaped its emotional future with a precision no one could undo. Her voice, once vulnerable to dismissal, now carried permanent authority. Her vision, once uncertain, now stood fulfilled, and her legacy, once threatened by time, now stood unbreakable. Because in the end, Diana didn't just leave behind jewels, she left behind a future she had chosen herself. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in next one.